leave it over to the folks debating, because y'all do not care about me talking on my soapbox, is that we have enjoy.
All right, with that being said, is everybody good?
Give me a second, because I need to share my screen to be able to show everyone my flow.
For sure.
Amazing. We're gonna share my desktop. Have you sent the 1AC?
Where do I send this again?
Can you upload that to the 4-week Discord group? That way I can screen share and have it on one side.
For sure.
To the folks who were asking about the 50 states regulation lecture, Micah is going to be posting a link that starts at 1 o'clock. So yeah, she'll be posting that in the 4-week group text channel.
Just so you know, Jonathan, you accidentally sent a blank document. You just got to save it first.
My bad.
No worries. It happens to everyone. So I will end up screen sharing. Something that's of note is how I divide my screen. Not everyone does it the way I do, but I tend to think if you are someone who flows on your computer, it's a little bit easier. So I like doing kind of having my flow on 75% of my desktop and having the speech doc on the other 25. So if you give me a sec, I'll show you what that looks like. I'm gonna close this. Perfect. So we'll screen share what my desktop looks like. So you all can see this. So I like doing it this way because it makes it a little bit easier to follow along and you have access to seeing both. Something that's important is the way Jonathan's going to start this speech, meaning before Jonathan starts, they're going to give you an off-time roadmap. For your 1AC, you don't need to say the names of any of the contentions or sheets of paper. All you have to do is say how many sheets of paper are needed. And so after that, Jonathan's not going to count down like a NASA astronaut, like some of you do. Instead, Jonathan's just going to ask if everyone's ready. And then once they get a clear sign, they're going to start. So let's let Jonathan do that now.
All right, for sure. So the off-time roadmap would be 3 pages for inherency, first advantage, and then the plan on solvency. Is everyone good to go? All righty. Speculative leasing for mining exploration has massively expanded the amount of federally leased land for fracking. Hein Kim Smith 20. More than 25,000 federal leases issued between 2003 and 2012. Approximately 85% were leased competitively. Of those competitive leases, slightly more than 1/4 were leased at a minimum of $2 per acre. Speculative leasing is common at the low end of price spectrum. For some developers, a low one-time bonus for a bid followed by annual rental payment of $1.50 or $2 per acre is a small price to pay. Moreover, the percentage of leases being given even through non-competitive sales surged in the first year of Trump's administration, the highest levels in over a decade. Speculative leasing is detrimental to both the environment and taxpayers, and recent uptick in the practice of non-competitive leasing only exacerbates these issues. The game of speculation is risky for private developers, perhaps more detrimental to the public. With such incentives, public land becomes a mere poker chip for private developers to the detriment of the public interest. Despite a statutory background that requires robust attention to the environment protection, current BLM practices suggest that in reality, development consideration often takes precedence in the planning process to the detriment of preservation. These leases preclude potential more valuable uses such as renewable energy production or management for wilderness characteristics while the land sits idle. While there is no potential to fluid mineral development in most of the land with wilderness characteristic units, the majority of the areas totaling 1,100 acres, 59% are already leased for oil and gas development companies. The there's zero will to regulate these practices now, both at the state and federal level. Bill Act 20. The EPA wavering, reluctant to categorically declare fracking harmful to the health has effectively resulted in a virtual absence of regulation of the federal level. States with abundance of shales, resources, and prevalent fracking operations has been hesitant to implement regulation, minimum regulations such as very regulatory one fracking exists either at the federal or at the state level. And advantage, environmental toxins. Fracking is one of the greatest threats to the environment, currently only phasing it out could sustain economic growth without sacrificing the earth. Plants regulation is key. Clinton, McGovern, Martinez 21. To protect communities across the country today as well as generations, the country must rapidly face out harmful fracking. Environmental pollutants caused by fracking are known risk factors for potential heart defects, and an estimated 17 million Americans live within 1 mile of fracking sites. More immediately, there are industries' ability to avoid federal environmental regulations and harm the health of communities without fracking is being conducted is alarming. This set exemptions became known as the Halliburton loophole. The frightening reality of the Halliburton loophole is that it allows companies to inject massive amounts of potential harmful chemicals into the earth and pollute the air without disclosing what they are doing. Fracking industry has cites a list of federal regulations. Fracking can degrade the water quality and may elevate maternal stress due to its noise and light pollution. Individuals living in low-income communities where the environmental pollutants tend to be concentrated at another group of disproportionately affected by fracking. Eliminating the Halliburton loophole and making fracking operations confirmed regulation as established for other industries will improve health of the environment. And in particular, fracking wastewater poisons groundwater supplies and ensures slow death for a nearby population, nearby native folks who are disproportionately impacted as a matter scale. That always, when regulation solves and aligns the demands of folks of the ground. Verse 21. Legal loopholes extend the fracking Environmental Safe Water Drinking Act and the EPA hazardous waste laws endanger surrounding communities and putting drinking water at risk contamination. Wastewater, a combination of flowback, a portion of the water used to fracture the rock to release fossil fuels, flows back to the surface and naturally occurring produces water that fracking process forces the surface is still ever present. Fracking produced 19 billion gallons of wastewater in North Dakota in 2018 alone. Both flowback and produced wastewater may contain heavy metals such as barium, lead, hydrocarbon, natural occurring radioactive materials norm, and incredibly high levels of salinity. Between 2005 and 2013, the EPA identified 1,084 different chemicals reported in fracking formulas, but sometimes weather, transportation, equipment malfunctions of wastewater can spill into the environment, contaminating the land, water around and beneath it. Once concerned an exemption of the Safe Drinking Water Act, known as the Halliburton loophole, that exempts the industry from the having to dispose of chemicals that use fracking and prevented the EPA from regulating fracking fluids. Solving fracking and wastewater comes down to these regulations, and the Halliburton loophole not only paves the way for massive environmental destruction and variety of health hazards, but it also siphons off experts need the regulatory or fracking practice, creating downward spirals and protections. Now is key for a full collapse of protection. March 21. There have been many attempts to close this loophole, but none has succeeded. Even when federal regulation do exist, meaningful enforcement has been lacking. The grand jury released a scathering 235-page report that documents a litany of health issues experienced by residents living near fracking sites. The report also highlighted the problem revolving door between industries and departments. DP employments are often hired away from the industries at much higher pay rates, creating a clear conflict of interest. This pattern has left many residents feeling ever within the complaints of investigating that results can be trusted. We found 12 chemicals that commonly emitted from fracking sites and one more the urine samples, including the benzene, toluene, naphthalene, and lesser known compounds like negative health impacts, including respiratory and gastronomic problems, skin, eye irritation, organ damage, and reproductive harms, and increased cancer risk. Only a handful of these chemicals are regulatory limit. Most will pertain to short-term workplace exposure. Even at low concentration, you have health impacts when it all comes together. There has been severe impacts of people's health. They treat the water with chloramine, which fears could future damage unhealthy kidneys, and there has been numerous reports of fracking wastewater contaminating the local water supply. Across the country, fracking often takes place in rural communities with similar limited health resources. And prefer impacts. Prioritizing essential risk equals a Pascal wages for closing the ability to increase incremental steps to a better world within 15. Essential risk strikes me as philosophically shallow. The essential risk argument seems to ignore there seems an innumerable amount of possible existential risk scenarios as well as an innumerable amount of possible workable technologies that might help prevent and mitigate it. We have resources to bet and substantially on them all unless we spread so thin that this action becomes meaningless. There are substantial opportunity cost attachment to those not using resources, a better proven strategy within better identify threats and problems, albeit it may not be as massive as the outcomes of existential risk scenarios. And this has become low probability. Conata 98. Improbable conflict scenarios affect the public policy discourse. Plausible false assumptions. The most far-fetched scenarios comprise numbers of links which may plausible or even probable dwindle with each step. Flood of our concerns with a horde of dangers that pass permissible non-zero probability by lower threshold. They establish an impossible standard. Strategic wisdom begins with strategic prioritizing. And war is unlikely. Spagat and Weasel 19. Data per capita terms of breaking point, including interested in as well as the interstate war, adjusting war population level essentially and anything resembles. The choice of cow, the Glennis war does not matter. The chance of drawing a truly huge war probably lower now. Substantial evidence the world have become more peaceful. And the plan, the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources by reversing the amendments of the Safe Water Drinking Act of 1974 imposed by the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Closing the Halliburton loophole is a heart reviving water protection exempts from Safe Water Drinking Act undermines all capacity response. Black 20. Arguably the most infamous federal exemption for fracking industry is Affordable Safe Water Drinking Act. The act of amendments of SWDA will, by allowing oil companies to refuse to disclose the chemicals identified in the contaminating the fracking wastewater, the exemption colloquially referred as the Halliburton loophole has allowed fracking corporations to pollute the bodies of water that provide drinking the water to hundreds of thousands of Americans each day. And the federal government has abdicated its water protection in the realms of fracking. Bills have been proposed to close the Halliburton loophole, which stumps this as, but has stalled, making the passage key. Government 15. The federal government has played a limited role, thus regulating oversight hydraulic fracturing, relieving the states of municipalities to manage the larger, fast-paced industry. The amendments is a welcome move, given the risk of drinking water associated with oil and gas development. Evidence suggests that the Halliburton loophole was put in by law and oil companies. However, in the end, the agency abandoned studies of water contamination in all three locations, demonstrating the limitation of agents' ability and willingness to investigate the hold actors accountable for instances of potential water contamination from oils and gas activities. And the federal government is key. Relying on states and local enforcement creates patchworks of informants knowledge that makes effective analysis wastewater impossible. Only coordinates under the EPA can ensure access to lands and relevant information. Rosenberg 13. Federal agencies, far from leading on the critical national and international issues, are taking backseat of the state. The current federal inaction is unfortunate and deep worrying. Federal agencies and enormous capacities and capability for research and analysis, monitoring, inspection, and enforcement unmatched by any state. Recent studies have shown that state regulatory systems are not up to the task of managing risks relating to conventional oils and gas development. We need a comprehensive, coherent of rules that bring federal and state capabilities into play to address the risks. There are real risks related to the unconventional oil and gas development, ranging from the social and environmental impacts of industrializing rural landscapes to public health and risks within communities. I'm good there.
Cool. Okay. First question, considering the ability for fracking to decrease U.S. dependence on foreign oil imports and increased national and individual economic prosperity, how does it worsen environmental degradation in the short and long term?
I think in the short term is that the way that fracking creates forms of issues and how certain industries and certain actors aren't allowed to disclose what they put into the environment is very detrimental to the environment now, because there is unknown damages being happened, also the known damages being happened that is presented in the 1AC.
Okay, and then what impact does fracking directly have on U.S. water resources and the environment, and how does the plan function to mitigate those harms?
So currently, wastewater is an issue that provides a bunch of detrimental to the current environment and the water in the US. And the way the AFS resolves that is that we put more regulations on the way what company does, means that the companies have to disclose the chemicals they use. And if a chemical is seen bad for the environment, it would not be allowed to use those chemicals during fracking.
Gotcha. And so
I'll add one thing real quick to that. It's specifically all of what was previously said is correct. Just one additional detail is that if the USFG does not require that there are specific disclosures to the wastewater that's being put into the ground, then more and more unidentifiable poisons, or I guess harder to identify poisons, are seeping into the groundwater. So that's how the AF directly.
Gotcha. Okay, so then how does the affirmative mitigate those environmental threats in light of other existing loopholes and the preferential treatment that your evidence describes for fossil fuel companies? Why is the Halliburton loophole key?
Well, we think that the Halliburton loophole is the biggest one, in which that a lot of companies use this specific loophole as a colloquial term, which means that it's pretty common. So stopping this loophole or providing regulations in this state is a step in the right direction, or a good stepping key to stopping forms of contamination.
Cool. And then the war on likely evidence, I think it was the weasel evidence. How does that contend with the complexity of international relations and the changing energy demands that we're currently operating within?
Well, I think what this evidence trying to say is that historically there's been multiple studies in which there's less likely forms of war due to the way that the world is building and expanding. Shows how it's become more peaceful. There's more forms of treaties within countries and other forms, which means that since war is less likely, we should prioritize stuff like environmental harm.
Cool. And
I'll
then,
also add to that real quick, the question of complexity also makes it less likely that war would occur, because there's so many moving parts that any given like national leader or national leading group must consider, and that generally stalls them.
cool, thanks.
All right, so before Delpra sends the 1NC, we're gonna take a look at my flow one more time. Something to notice for all of you is how that cross-ex went down. What are some things that we're noticing? What are moments you really liked? Feel free to just unmute and share your thoughts thus far. I see a lot of you in one camera. Do you maybe want to unmute and give us some thoughts on cross-ex? There you go.
I like the specific questions asked and how they got straight to the point. Yeah. They were really detailed questions.
Good point. I super agree. But did you also see how Jackson started citing evidence by name, was reading lines from the cards, and then the way Jonathan and Squid handled it was referencing back other lines from those cards and citing that evidence back? That's a really great cross-ex sort of moment, because for all of us who are judging or watching the debate and who have the speech docs in front of us, we can go read that card with them and see whose reading is more correct, which side do you think is kind of nailing it. That's something really important. And you also saw how Jackson had a lot of different questions. So some of you in your practice space this morning maybe only got one question in cross-ex kind of out. Think about how Jackson was able to have a lot of questions. And that's because Jackson, during the 1AC, was able to write down some questions or ideas of questions so that they were prepared to ask them. That's a really, really effective strategy. So let's have Delpra submit the 1NC to the, there we go. I will pull it up. And then before we start, I'm gonna see if you all can see Delpra talking as I have it set up. So you can also see my flow. So let's see. Let's maybe make you like this at the top. Tech is fun. Does this work?
I'm looking at the YouTube. Sorry, I'm like a floating voice. I'll look at the YouTube now to see what it shows.
I'm gonna see if you all can.
Let's see. So it shows your face.
Make you like this at the top. Tech is fun.
Have you okay, let me pause that. That's gonna are they pinned?
Yes.
They are pinned. Okay. I think it is just the share screen.
If I have it like this, or I could make it just one person. No, I think I have to do this way. Or I can spotlight.
Yeah, I think that maybe, so, because right now I'm wondering, because it's dependent on like your view, or because I wonder when you're doing presentations on Zoom, if you're able to like still see the people and like it can show them while you're talking.
I do know, maybe if you fast forward, does it work? Does it look good now? Because I do have.
Let me check. I paused it. Let me refresh the feed. I think that maybe so because right now I'm wondering. Right now you don't show like your view. It's the same. Honestly, I think that like the flowing part is important. So we'll just make sure that like they're gallery view and pinned during like cross-X. Yeah. All of them pinned. Yeah.
Everything sorted out?
I think we're good.
Awesome. So as a brief off-time roadmap, as Anna mentioned earlier, before the 1 and C, we'll say the order of off case, and then we'll say the on case in the order. So my particular order is going to be 3 off case, and then the advantage, and then solvency. So that means grab 3 new sheets of paper, and then put the advantage first, and then solvency first.
Something I want to point out to all of you who are flowing along. Do you see how I'm starting 10 squares down? That's because you want to leave space at the top of all of your flows, even if it's on paper, for the overview. So in the 2AC, if Squid ends up having an overview at the top before answering whatever argument Sophia makes on the case right here, I will float that up on the top. And that's a really good way to be able to track the overviews and leave space. Another thing you can notice is how there's space between these arguments. That makes it easier. So between every argument Delpra makes and Jonathan made, you have space. So one argument's expanding it bigger throughout the debate, like a crescendo. You have room, and that's really helpful as well. And then labeling every page as well. So you see how I can just move it around because I know it goes advantage and solvency. So make sure all your flows have labels as well. And those are some helpful little tips and tricks. And then let's let Delpra do it.
Awesome. First off is topicality. Interpretation. Protection of water resources is direct intervention to remedy and prevent pollution of wetlands and riparian sources. That's COF no date. Wetlands and underdeveloped areas adjacent to streams serve as filtration mechanism to prevent water resources from pollutants. Wetlands and riparian buffers around rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds provide natural stormwater filtration systems, cleaning stormwater runoff before it enters the water body. Buffers also provide flood control as they can naturally absorb fluctuations in water levels, protecting adjacent private property. Interventions are necessary to prevent further degradation of our region's water resources and to preserve them from multitude of benefits they provide for the economy, economic development, meeting drinking water needs, human enjoyment, and ecosystem functioning. Violation. The Act regulates fracking practices, not water resources. It's a voting issue for fairness and education. Plan explodes limits to include anything that impacts water, rather than centering on water protection, undermines stable neg links and counterplaying ground. Next off is the economy disadvantage. Uniqueness. U.S. energy prices are low and stable now. An increase in fracking is necessary to maintain low prices. Clemente 319. The primary reason why our national energy modeling system continually sees lower gas prices and robust production, new U.S. gas production will easily outpace our demand growth to keep domestic prices low. The U.S. fracking industry now supplies 85 to 90% of our gas, deploys evolving technologies to do more with less. Consolidation is complementing deep-pocketed bigger companies with smaller, more agile, and technically advanced ones, creating a synergy that will continue to cut costs. This boom in U.S. gas production, bringing lower costs, will have even more countries shopping for American gas. And low-cost gas has allowed us to avoid the overbearing regulations and expensive energy that has plagued Europe. Link. Any ban on fracking would spike electricity prices and devastate the economy. BESDEC 2020. Fracking is the major reason the U.S. is the world's leading natural gas and oil producer, and over 90% of U.S. natural gas and oil wells are currently developed via fracking. Increased shale production brought in 8 times increase in natural gas extraction productivity and a 19 times increase in oil. These gains have reduced costs and increased production to record-breaking levels. The U.S. become the world's largest producer of both commodities. Shale production has reduced the domestic price of natural gas by 63%, leading to a 45% decrease in the price of electricity and reduced the global price of oil by 10%. These savings are in addition to economic benefits linked to greater employment in the O&G sector. A U.S. fracking ban would devastate the economy. Energy prices would increase dramatically, and the price for natural gas, currently the largest source of U.S. power generation, would increase by 324%, reaching $12.30. This would increase costs for American families, businesses, and utilities, and cause household energy bills to more than quadruple. Consumers would pay 37% more for petroleum products such as gasoline and diesel in 2021, with prices continuing to rise. The ban would decrease annual U.S. household income on average $5,040. And the impact: economic decline leads to global war. Tonneson 15. Interdependence raises the cost of conflict for all sides, but asymmetrical or unbalanced dependencies and negative trade expectations may generate tensions leading to trade wars among interdependent states that in turn increase the risk of military conflict. Decisions for war and peace are taken by very few people who act on the basis of future expectations. If leaders on either side of the Atlantic begin to seriously fear or anticipate their own nation's decline, then they might blame this on external dependence and ultimately refuse to be deterred by nuclear arms. The greatest risk that changes in the world economy alter those circumstances in ways that render interstate peace more precarious. Nuclear deterrence remaining the only factor to protect the world from Armageddon, and unreliably so, deterrence could lose its credibility. Next off is the patents counterplan. Counterplan text. The United States Patent Office should offer patents for fracking fluids and incentives for filing for patents in the United States. Solvency. It's superior to regulation, which fails because of patchwork information collection. Johnson 21. Overall, the use of patents to protect fracking fluids as opposed to trade secrets provides relative advantages to all parties involved. Patents provide fracking operators with stronger, more readily enforceable intellectual property protections. Disclosure is a requirement for patent protection. While trade secrets are only protectable against misappropriation, fracking operators can enforce their rights against other parties that infringe their claimed invention, irrespective of whether the party created the invention independently. Fracking operators have increasingly utilized broad patent protection to pursue claims of infringement against competitors that have infringed on patent fluid technology. The possibility of a patent monopoly and the greater protection that comes with it would likely incentivize operators to develop better, more advanced fluids. Accordingly, fracking patent applications provide more useful information than any existing disclosure regulation. Next is the case. First, on the advantage. 1. Plan doesn't solve growth. Johnson 21. The fracking of the tight oil now accounts for 61% of U.S. crude oil production. This newfound boom in tight oil has allowed the United States to equal or surpass Saudi Arabia in crude oil production every year since 2013, and has led to a significant decrease in America's dependence on foreign crude oil. In short, fracking is an economic and geopolitical force that has catalyzed significant growth in the United States and added hundreds of thousands of jobs to the energy sector. In this vein, fracking operators have treated various aspects of their fracking fluids as confidential trade secrets to maintain an advantage over their competitors. 2. No impact from fracking fluids, AFP 15. The controversial oil and gas extraction technique known as fracking poses no widespread danger to U.S. drinking water, the U.S. Environmental Agency says. In a long-awaited assessment, the risk is small compared to the number of fracking wells in use. 3. No connection between regulating fracking and saving the environment. And, turn, banning domestic fracking increases emissions from oil exports. That's O'Scanlan 21. The U.S. can meet its climate goals while maintaining oil and natural gas leasing, exploration, and development on federal lands and waters. Because of these efforts, greenhouse gas emissions from the extraction and combustion of oil and natural gases from federal lands account for less than 10% of the total estimated U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Over 98% of the greenhouse gas emissions often cited are as associated with the production of oil and natural gas on federal lands is from an end-use combustion of the resource, not from extraction. 4. Dishads are systemically underestimated in debates. Wiener 16. That rare risk outweighs other risks depends on their probability and consequences compared to other risks that appropriate responses will depend on policy options. Research in psychology and political economy indicates catastrophic risks are systemically neglected. People exhibit heightened concerns about the risks that are available to their mind. The availability heuristic helps explain why people express greater concerns about airplane accidents than automobile accidents. This may be the case for unusual but experienced events that are available in the public mind and induce strong feelings such as dread. The public seems less interested if it takes these extreme risks seriously at all. 5. No war is bunk. Closet 18. Without a complete understanding of mechanisms that promote interstate war, it is unclear whether the post-war pattern of peace will continue. Analysis here finds the post-war pattern of peace is remarkably unsurprising. Similarly, long periods of relative peace are common occurrences in the naturally variable statistics of interstate wars. The long peace is not evident by itself of a change in underlying mechanisms that generate conflict. The post-war pattern of relative peace would need to endure its current form at least another 100 years before it would become statistically unusual enough to justify a genuine trend. Next is solvency. 1. Act doesn't solve. Freiberg 21. Federal environmental and natural resource protection laws and regulations like the Clean Water Act and SDWA are riddled with loopholes and preferential treatment for fossil fuels companies. The most notorious oil and gas exemption is the Halliburton loophole, which exempts hydraulic fracturing from SDWA underground injection control regulation. The significant shortcomings of the UIC program means that the closing the loophole and regulating fracking under the UIC program would not be enough. Martha credit enough. And 2, status quo regulation solves. That's O'Scalin 21. Technological and in certain cases, state regulatory advances have allowed water producers to minimize use of fresh water sources in favor of non-potable, low-quality water or produced water. Most states have extensive water quality and quantity regulations overseen by a wide range of agencies, including key program areas to support the CWA's fishable, swimmable goals for all surface waters in the state. These programs assess the quality of surface waters and set standards for protection of waters. Mark the card at waters. I am open for cross.
You being good, I will start off with the first question. I want to start off at the advantage page. So your AFP 15 evidence specifically talks about fracking in like international scenarios. How does that relate to the like AF?
Sure. So it might be talking about fracking in environmental services. However, the agent that is used is the the environmental services that you're talking about is there's a news agency in Paris, France that is talking about United States environmental agencies. So the review that was studied, it might be published internationally, but they're specifically studying United States fracking.
For sure. Next, you say that there's a turn that like the app leads to more emissions. How?
Yeah, so we would say the turn that banning domestic fracking increases emissions from oil exports because right now, with fracking, the United States gets most of its oil domestically produced ourselves. However, if we ban fracking, it means that increasing of emissions happens because we're importing greenhouse gas emitting products from overseas.
All right, that sounds good. All right, moving on to the T. The violation is that the app isn't directly for water resources, right?
Yes. So our violation on topicality goes with our interpretation. Our interpretation says that to topically protect water resources, you have to directly intervene to remedy and prevent pollution. That means going into wetlands, cleaning them up, cleaning up the Everglades. However, regulating fracking practices is not directly going into wetlands. It's not directly implementing a policy solution that it's in and of itself helps clean up wetlands or water sources.
All right, for sure. And now on the this side, how does the link story work? How does the app lead to an economic war or war caused through economic decline?
Yeah, sure. So this is a pretty interesting link story. It's pretty straightforward. Besnick says that U.S. fracking ban would devastate the economy. A couple of reasons for this is that shale production has reduced domestic price of natural gas by 63%, led to a 45% decrease in the price of electricity, and reduced the global price of oil by 10%. This is all because the United States, with fracking, is a leader in oil production. However, if U.S. oil and fracking is banned, that not only affects the United States, but because of our influence worldwide, it also affects the entire world. Our Tonneson evidence is really good by saying that interdependence, which is when countries trade with each other and do business with each other, is affected because of the way that oil is traded around the world with different customers.
For sure. With that being said, how does the counterplan avoid this set?
Sure. So our counterplan kind of does a similar thing in a different vein. By offering patents, our Johnson evidence says that creating new and better fracking fluids as incentivized by these patents means that these fluids would be better for the environment. And they wouldn't ban fracking in its entirety, which means it avoids the economic collapse dissad because it wouldn't ban fracking. It would just regulate it in a different sense than the affirmative.
For sure.
All right, that was awesome. I'm going to share again before Squid gives an order. Maybe they're even going to take a little bit of prep, who knows? Either way, we're going to take a second to look at some things on the flow to make it a little easier. So we not only have our negative pages titled appropriately, something that not everyone does is flow the text of the counterplan. That's really important, especially if you're debating, because it means you actually are holding yourself accountable to checking the text for any flaws or tricks. So for example, a delay counterplan, having a future Congress do the plan to avoid the net benefit of a politics disad that would happen now, would be kind of tricky to discover. So what if they changed the date or snuck in the number of Congress? So instead of the 175th or whatever session of Congress we're going into or in right now, they cite a specific one later on in the future. That's a reason why you want to flow your counterplan text. Something else that's important. So when Delprat marked evidence, did you see how I pressed enter at enough where Delprat marked it? So you have in your own document, if you're debating or judging, this is important, where that mark is. And then I also put it on my flow. I put mark at enough. That helps you. So I wrote mark at water before I actually did it in my document. So now I know where to go back and put the mark if I couldn't do it at the same speed. So that's a really helpful trick. Something you're going to notice here, like I mentioned, is because we scooted down those 10 squares, like a third or a quarter of your piece of paper, if you're flowing on paper, when Squid gives that advantage overview, I have the space to flow it. And I can number their responses based upon what I have for Delprat's. So I might put 1, 2, 3 here, but that applies to number 1. And that's a really helpful system. And that was something also great about this 1 and C, that you now have numbers to associate. So if in the block, Delprat or Jackson says, extend 1 and C1, now you know in your flow exactly what that number 1 is, and you can keep track. Or they can give it a number, like extend the argument that the plan doesn't solve growth. The last thing I'm going to note before we let Squid give this awesome 2AC is you're going to notice I'm not writing out all of the words of the tags. Instead, I'm putting abbreviations. So instead of plan, I like putting a P. Instead of solvency or anything like any sort of iteration of that word, I put an S. Instead of leads to, equal sign. An exclamation point is an impact. That's a really helpful way. So you don't have to write out the full tag, especially if you're handwriting and you need to be quick and efficient. And then you always put the cite. So in cross-X, you can remember how Delprat and Jonathan just did this. They cite authors by name. So you actually have on your flow what author goes with each argument. I like putting an X before the author name in citation, just so I can tell it's a cite and not another argument. And with that, we're gonna let Squid do it after giving an awesome roadmap.
Awesome. Can y'all hear me? Yes? No? Can you hear me? Oh, okay, but all right. The order is going to be topicality, and then the advantage with the overview on top. And then I will go to solvency. Then I'm gonna go and destroy this disad real quick. Bum. And then I'm gonna do the patents counterplan. Speak now if you need that repeated.
For any of the debaters, do you have any thoughts on this order? What are questions you're having? Unmute if you do. And I know there are lots of you in one Zoom, so one of you should unmute and give me your thought on this order of the 2AC.
I'm big on call out culture, so pick something.
All right. Zoe, you were just affirmative. What is something you just learned when being affirmative about the order? What do you think? Do you think this order is competitive?
You should always put case first, so you don't drop it by accident.
Yeah, so this is actually something that's kind of a hot take or an either or. So people sometimes like putting case on top. I will always put case on top when I debate just because that's how I learn. But Squid's going to put T first. This is something that is actually okay in debate. T is the only argument you can put before the case, but that's kind of thing you can choose for yourself. The thing that I was going to point out was the choice to put the counterplan last. do all of you, let's have Skylar, if you're still in that Zoom, why do you think the counterplan or disad should go after the case?
Maybe the disad.
So you think that the disad should go before the counterplan? Why is that?
Because
think about it this way. Let's say you accidentally, in getting all your flows together, drop the last flow. Would you rather drop a disad or drop a counterplan?
I'd rather drop a disad.
Yeah, why is that?
Because I think the counterplan is a really important part of the argument, which is why you should really have that. That's like an essential part that you should have, and you should.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to have Squid edit this order slightly to show you why the counterplan should go before the disad, because the reason is you want to answer any critique or counterplan after the case, because if you drop it on accident, it's scary, meaning that's something that already solves your AF. And the AF is your biggest weapon or your biggest piece of offense in the debate. It means every reason that the AF's a good idea already gets rid of the disad. So even if you already dropped the disad, like Skylar said, it's not ideal and it's probably a bad situation for you, but you can still come back. You can still say, but the case outweighs, here's why. It's still a good idea. So that's why we put fiated things before disads. Sorry, Squid. All right, we'll do the order again.
Okay, I got you. I'm still doing T first, but then I'm gonna go to the advantage with the overview. And then I'm going to solvency and counterplan, and then the disad. Which I just realized. I just had page directions that I needed to correct. Okay, is everyone ready? Speak now, or I shall begin. Timer. Okay. We meet. The AF is the core of the topic. You can't think about fracking practices without thinking about water protection. That's Johnson 21. The litigation about the federal regulation of fracking fluids centers on the Safe Drinking Water Act, with underground injection control, or UIC program, serving as the primary enforcement mechanism of the act. Prefer our interpretation for multiple reasons. The first is it's best to ensure predictable limits. Fracking is a major threat to water resources, which is the core of the resolution. The negatives interpretation is far too limiting because it forces for the affirmatives with small mechanisms in order to meet their interpretation. That inherently counteracts their claim about reasonable limits, because it makes it so that each AF is so much smaller, so much harder to research for, that they're not going to have access to their neg links that they claim that their interpretation provides. Only our interpretation is best for providing that reasonable limit on affirmatives and ensuring that we can still have in-depth topic-centered debates. Second, don't buy any of their potential abuse claims. They're all moot. It's a form of predictive policing that it guarantees judge intervention, because the judge then has to determine whether or not what we have done will possibly lead to other people doing what they want in their realms. 3, fairness is mute. They have no metric for determining what is fair and what isn't, and any metric that they establish is inherently subjective, which makes it impossible for the for the judge to equally enforce. The last thing, default to reasonability. They didn't give you a metric for determining how you evaluate their interpretations, so you default to reasonability, because the only other, i.e. competing interpretations, will force us into a race to the bottom over the specifics of interpretations, not within relationship to debate. The case. First, on the overview, status quo mining contracts are the threshold of inherency. This wasn't negated. Absent the F, fracking explodes to or continues to explode past manageable levels. That's the Hein, Kim, Smith, and Balak evidence. Now is key to prevent full collapse of water protection. The F closes the Halliburton loophole, which forces regulations on federal fracking lands. It solves the direct poisons entering the groundwater supplies and reverses the disproportionate death rates. That's Bruce, Clinton, McGovern, and Martinez. I'll do the line-by-line debate here now. First, growth will be answered on the disad, but this card is about a lack of disclosure, which is in cross-examination how we clarify what the 1AC does. There will also be no job loss, because those experts that are currently employed in the field will be able to assist in the regulations. That's the Clinton and Martinez evidence. The second claim they make, their AFP evidence is literally from 2005, and it has 2 sentences. If you can point out a warrant, I will give you the money in my wallet, because there are none in it. There's no reason why the evidence should be evaluated, even if you think that their claims are decent. Our evidence postdates and addresses changes in domestic fracking since 2015. Their evidence specific to international fracking, which is non-responsive to our scenario that is unique to U.S. water sources. I already said the thing about this F having no warrants. The third evidence that they read, the turn is unfounded. Emissions are being heavily regulated now, and focus on emissions crowds attention away from fracking. That's the block evidence about experts. Even if emissions rise post-app, fracking regulations would counteract the negative environmental impact and give way for further environmental regulations surrounding fracking and water protection. That's Murasak 21 evidence. I'll do the solvency stuff here. Their first evidence, their Greenberg 21 evidence, it's false. It cites the exact loophole that the 1AC is going out to address. Also, the residual issues around the Halliburton are addressed post-aft because of the momentum gained by its passing. They didn't even get to that part in the card, but I went ahead and threw that out anyways. The second card, they say status quo solves. This says private contractors are going to be the ones, or that private contractors are currently regulating themselves, which is not true. Our evidence, our Bruce evidence, and our Mursock evidence is specific that private contractors are unable to regulate themselves effectively because there are disparate information collection sectors. Impacts will be on the disad. Let's go to the counterplan. First, permutation do both. It's a test competition. The U.S. Patents Office can work in tandem with the USFG on enforcement. There's no reason why they should disengage from one another in the passing of the affirmative. And absent the USFG litigations, patents are impossible. Johnson 21. There are significant legal practical obstacles that will prevent the patent system from protecting the fluid composition. For most fracking operators, the utility is unlikely to be an issue in the context of fracking fluids because a patent will only be withheld on utility grounds if it has no practical utility. This requirement is considered by many to be the ultimate condition of patentability, and it's at the heart of the stats at the patent quid pro quo. The novelty requirement is, however, the largest legal obstacle to patent protection for the fracking operators. While the use of fracking fluids on a well is not within most common definitions of public, the Fifth Circuit established that the touchstone of publicity, is the lack of deliberate efforts to conceal the invention and protect its secrecy. Therefore, it is unlikely that there be any public use of the prior art by a third-party fracking operator that creates a novelty bar for a given formula. Practically, this means that any fracking operator that has used a fracking fluid commercially for extraction, even under strict trade secrecy, will be barred from patenting the fluid unless they file within a year of the first commercial use. And permutation, do the aft and the counterplan. There's no reason why the patents need to come first. If anything, absent the aft, patents will fail without the prior litigation in order to enforce them. This is Johnson 21. Even if fracking fluids are patentable, there are the practical obstacles that make it unlikely and many operators will abandon their trade secret claims in favor of patent protection. The prosecution process takes on average over 2 years to complete and costly. The prolonged nature of prosecution makes the patent system a forfeit for fracking operators. Due to the inconsistent nature of fracking fluid formulas, many operators will likely prefer to continue protecting their intellectual property through trade secrecy, which requires no application and is created contemporaneously with the secret. Because most fracking fluids are protected vigilantly as trade secrets and the fluids themselves are interjected in the ground, it will be exceedingly difficult for the patentees to detect infringement in the market. Cut the card at market. Go on to the impact or the disad. I'll do the impact debate first. The app massively outweighs. First on magnitude, the protections are key to preventing the water resource disparities that occur at a global level or at a global scale. Poisoned water causes the slow death of vulnerable populations that are typically left out of these calculations, which inherently makes the affirmative more preferable to the negative impact scenarios. Only the app addresses the starting point for the larger social and federal conflicts. That's the first evidence. Second, probability. Their DAs assume improbable conflict scenarios and utilize fear tactics in order to create action around them. You should prefer statistically verified scenarios like federal fracking over their hyperbolic dangers. And the only reason dissents are underestimated in debates is because of their exaggeration of time frame and threshold. Prove the likelihood of your scenario. If you don't like that, no one buys your impacts. I'll do the uniqueness debate. Electricity prices are increasing now due to increased demand from COVID recovery. This is Dismaro and 527. Gasoline, electricity, natural gas are getting pricier. Gas prices have risen after the pandemic /demand in 2020 and forced the prices downward. Another reason for higher prices, the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack had residual impacts on the nation's gas supply. Raising gas prices, consumer energy is expected to have the largest gas price increase of more than 17%. And the act is key to renewable energy transition. So in 2020, if we want to transition from fossil fuel emissions as we work towards building 100% clean economy, holding back from fracking is a critical first step. Failure to act will only make the crisis at hand even more detrimental for future generations. If we are serious about clean air and clean drinking water to combat climate change, the only safe way to move forward is to ban fracking nationwide. Fracking is a key driver of the recent global spike in methane emissions. All right, then get to the last card, and I had cut the last Johnson 21 EV on the counter plan at Marquette. I am good for cross that.
Awesome. Let's start on the counterplan. Come to the act, then the counterplan. You mentioned how absent the affirmative, the counterplan will fail based on certain litigation. What is this litigation and why does it matter in the context of the counterplan?
The litigation is specifically the plan text. Unless we resolve let me pull up the exact wordage. Unless we address the way in which, or unless we apply reversing the amendment on the Safe Water Drinking Act imposed by the Energy Policy Act in 2005, any attempts at patent regulation or utilizing patent offices in order to enforce environmental safety standards inherently fails because there is inconsistency in the enforcement mechanism itself.
Okay, that makes sense. On topicality, fourth point, reasonability. What is your metric for what is reasonable or not?
I don't establish that metric, and I think the point of reasonability is that the lack thereof a metric is useful because it allows for us to have a fully functioning debate with the creative moves that allow one word to be interpreted one way in one round and then be interpreted another way in the next round. We think that reasonability should be determined by A, whether or not there's still reasonable ability for one to negate the affirmative, but B, whether or not we are still, it sounds kind of basic, but reasonably within the topic.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Your SOTO evidence on the econ DA. The affirmative is a critical first step. What is that first step and what steps does it lead to down the road to be able to solve emissions and for renewables?
Right. So I think that this can be clarified in the discussion of the counter plan. A, the specific first steps is addressing at the federal level the laws that are currently allowing for microcosms of environmental degradation to occur because certain private companies like commercial entities are able to act outside of the purview of the larger regulations as they are interpreted.
Okay.
I was just going to say real quick, the next steps after that is once they get momentum behind environmental safety regulations, we can see that other energy production sectors will also be regulated. I can't speak to the specifics, but it's a momentum thing.
Okay. What does the plan specifically do to regulate and help solve the damage that has already been done to the environment?
Right. So I think it would be kind of absurd to ask that the affirmative reverse all of the environmental degradation that has occurred because the U.S. is incredibly capitalist, but there's a lot that would have to happen. But I do think that in regard to the wastewater being leached into groundwater, The question of reversal comes from the question of stopping it from ever occurring continuously. Like water is a cycle, it is reused numerous ways. So the reversal would be changing the way in which we utilize that water now, i.e. stop poisoning it, and then we will slowly see the effects of that poisoned groundwater degrade.
All right, so for Alex and Ben who are in Zoom, can one of you give me some thoughts on that 2AC? What was a moment that you really liked? Maybe have Alex go first. Can you unmute and share with us?
Yeah, I like the way that the evidence was pretty clear and it was explained really well, because sometimes evidence tends to be a little unclear and it's a lot of words. So I like that I was.
Yeah, I super agree. So that's something of note here as well. Squid did a really great job when answering different arguments to extend their own. So on the case, you can see that here, when they said the plan doesn't solve growth as an answer, they had multiple arguments here. Like 1, we'll answer this on the disad. 2, this card's wrong, it doesn't apply, we solve it. 3rd, here is still an answer to the warrants of the evidence with the lines from the AF or pieces of 1AC evidence that I'm going to cite that tells you where to look to find the more of those warrants. So that's a really helpful way to get the judge to go back and reread your AF and to really just make it seem like the 1AC said this all along. The 1AC is the best idea in the world. We've already been over this. Come on, let's catch up. And that's a really great way to go about it. Something of note on the counter plan is how Squid explained what the permutation means, meaning how it would function. Something to note is they also said there's not a trade-off. That's a really great argument to make. The next step for you all as a challenge is adding a line in why the counter plan links to the disad. So thinking about for future debates for you all who are going to use these files, why would the patents counter plan link to the econ disad? That's a really great argument to make in your 2AC because it helps set up a lot of 1AR flexibility, but it also explains why if the counterplay links to the disad, then it's not really a competitive option. It kind of just makes the F seem like a better idea because in comparison, counterplan's not that great. Other things to note is how we're kind of splitting up different parts of the flow. So here, I'm not putting as much space because there's 3 arguments answering this one. That's because I just tend to flow straight down. And if you're flowing on paper, you probably want to leave a little bit of space between each argument to line it up more. But it's okay on a case debate because it all kind of ends up getting condensed throughout. You just want to have that space so it can grow because what started as 2 lines is now 3. And you're going to see that throughout the debate, no matter what the argument is. And then labeling for yourself when something's answered on the disad is really helpful. The last thing we're going to talk about, I'm sorry if I already said that was the last thing, this is the real last thing before Jackson gives an awesome 2NC, is that Squid chose to put the framing debate on the disad. That's something you can do. It's very much different strokes, or different folks, different strokes. So it's a stylistic decision. This helps you because when someone extends the disad, they're going to do their impact work at the top with an overview. And so what Squid did is just put it here at the top to condense that debate. You can do that, or you can keep the framing debate separate. You can make it a little bit easier. But this was a really smart decision because it was a bigger 1NC. And by putting the impact debate on this one flow, Squid was able to contextualize it to the disad to actually explain why disads are underestimated, why those framing arguments from the 1AC apply to the disad. And they're doing that work so you can kind of get a sense of where this debate's going to head in relation to this impact debate. With that said, let's have Jackson give us an order.
Cool. It's going to be T and then case. And the document should have been sent to.
Just to check, what is the order of case?
The order of case is going to be advantage and then solvency.
Awesome. For the advantage, are we starting with the overview or the line by line?
We're starting with the line by line.
Sounds
the
good.
overview is housed within solvency pretty much. So.
Awesome. So those follow-up questions are helpful if you're flowing or judging a debate, because now you know where to start flowing and where to line things up. So your flow can look as close to Jackson's as possible, which is really helpful. All right, let's do it.
Cool. First, on topicality, the COF evidence is clear. Direct intervention to remedy and prevent the pollution of wetlands and riparian sources is the protection of water resources. Anything else is going to be distinct and non-topical. Their Johnson evidence insists on a connection to the topic, but just because fracking practices are interconnected with water resources doesn't make the act topical. Without an alternative definition of protection of water resources, you should err negative on this question. And protection of water resources is water management, distinct from the affirmative. Cody Schneider and team at 17. Congress has enacted hundreds of water-related laws, activities including responding to natural disasters, conducting oversight over federal water supply management, improving water resources and water quality, infrastructure, and protecting fish and wildlife. The violation, again, is the affirmative regulates fracking practices, not water resources, and you should prefer our interpretation. 1, the plan explodes limits and undermines stable neg lengths and counterplaying ground, which is essential to fairness in education, critical in discussions which intend to forecast the implications of real-world policymaking. And 2, fracking is not the core of the resolution. Our interpretation places clear and reasonable limits on the purview of the debate, allowing for robust, in-depth discussions about the possibilities for real-world policymaking in a fair format. And 3rd, asking the judge to vote on potential abuse is not a form of predictive policing, but rather a way to hold the affirmative accountable for their choices in constructing the 1AC. The 1AC has infinite prep time, meaning they should be able to defend the entirety of the act and why their plan is topical. And then on the claim of defaulting to reasonability, there's 3 responses. 1, they aren't reasonable, proven in the standards debate. 2, competing interpretations is good because it rewards debaters that prepare the best interpretations of the topic. And 3, reasonability leads to judge intervention because judges do not have a precise notion of what is reasonable or not. Fairness and education are essential to robust and productive debates over the topic and are violated by the affirmative's plain text. These outweigh their standards of predictability in order to maintain the unique epistemological functions of an activity like debate. T is a prerequisite voting issue and comes first. If they've made the game unfair and the negative is inherently disadvantaged and has less of a possibility to win and produces shallow debates centered around procedural concerns rather than the intricacies of the protection of water resources. Go to case. First on the advantage. First, extend plan doesn't solve growth. Fracking accounts for 61% of U.S. crude oil production, leading to a significant decline in dependence on foreign crude oil. Fracking should be understood as an economic and geopolitical force, which is behind the significant growth of the energy sector in the United States and the provision of hundreds of thousands of jobs. The fracking industry has amassed a wide array of trade secrets, which incentivize innovation in the marketplace and maintain advantages over international competitors. The plan does nothing to challenge the continuation of this growth, making their impacts inevitable. That's the Johnson evidence. The affirmative is not able to solve for lack of disclosure with remaining loopholes and the continued preferential treatment for fossil fuel companies. Yes, there is job loss in the world of the affirmative. They read no evidence that experts will be freed up to assist in the regulations. Second, even if AFP evidence is from 2015, the findings have remained the same, with experts concluding the threat to drinking water is exaggerated and overblown. AFP is not specific to international fracking just because it comes from an international agency, but considers instead the conditions of the United States through the evaluations of the Environmental Protection Agency. Changes in fracking over the past 6 years have only improved the practice and made it less damaging than before. Third, the turn is not unfounded. Closing the Halliburton loophole does little to revive water protection, considering the U.S. can meet its climate goals without the affirmative plan, and the plan would only function to increase emissions from oil imports. Without proving curtailed demand, the affirmative makes conditions worse by necessitating the importation of oil and natural gas from countries with different standards, making the impacts of environmental degradation go global. And their Marasic evidence on this question is wrong. Fracking regulations wouldn't counter the negative impact of rising emissions, as the industry only accounts for less than 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions, according to the most recent data from the U.S. Geological Survey. And that's the O'Scanlan piece of evidence. And fracking is regulated in the SCO, and the federal government lacks the expertise to do it properly. Jacobs 21. History proved an effective guide. When SWDA was passed in 1974, hydraulic fracturing had already been in use for 25 years. At no point in the process was the concept of SCWA regulation over fracturing ever considered a necessity or even a possibility. Fourth, their no war calculus is wrong. Only the negatives lens of analysis promotes a complete understanding of the mechanisms which fuel environmental degradation and the possibility of interstate war. Acknowledging the interconnectedness of complex social and biological systems indicates the need for continued efforts to ensure peace under current conditions, which holds a high probability for crisis escalation and conflict. That's the Johnson evidence again. You should prioritize the impacts of the negative. Discussions of existential risk are critically important to understand the complexity of international relations. Their Munta evidence on the question is not contextual to the economic downturn we've outlined in our BESDEC evidence, which leads to high probability for interstate and proxy conflict. Characterizing this conversation as philosophically shallow as the evidence reads shields the affirmative from offering warranted responses to the internal link chain of our evidence. More on the impact debate in the 1NR. The Tonneson evidence is also excellent on this question and should be preferred because it is more contextual to the complexity of interdependent international relations. Solvency. The affirmative's plan to close the Halliburton loophole is unable to mitigate the expansion of fracking and the harms of environmental degradation described by the case. There's no enforcement mechanism for regulations post-plan, meaning you should be suspect of the plan's ability to challenge the current industry's ability to avoid federal environmental regulation and harm the health of the communities where fracking is being conducted, which is outlined by their Martinez evidence on the first advantage. Rather, the plan would just remove one possible avenue by which this currently occurs and fails to provide established regulations by which the fracking industry can be held to. And the affirmative offers no clear articulation of how the plan's functions to force the application of regulations in the light of the history of avoidance, which characterizes the fracking industry. It means you should be skeptical of the plan's ability to solve the issue of poisoned groundwater and associated deaths, and the AF doesn't solve. Closing the Halliburton loophole means that fracking is exempt from underground injection control regulation, but because those regulations have holes in enforcement, it means the plan isn't enough. There's a laundry list of activities that aren't covered by either law, including discharge of produced water into unlined pits, spills that may impact soil or groundwater, reuse of produced water for agricultural or other uses, chemical use and mixing, land application of waste, and water consumption by the industry, and that's Grosso in 21. And the status quo is able to solve. States are regulating water policy, and agencies overseeing companies can remain in alignment with water policy goals. That's again the O'Scanlan piece of evidence. Go quick back to the T page. Didn't realize I have this much time here. Go back to the question of reasonability. So on the question of reasonability, Squid said that we didn't need to provide any metric for the standard of reasonability, but also demands that we need to provide a metric for sort of the fairness of the debate. With understanding how those standards operate, if we don't have any reasonable way to determine, what reasonability looks like, or one sec. If we don't have any way to ensure the metric for reasonability, there shouldn't be a reason that we need to have a metric for fairness. If we are keeping the debate within the realms of fairness and within the realms of reasonability, also, you should again prefer our standards on this flow, primarily because of the context of debate and how it operates in order to create real world policy implications. Fairness and education are essential to those, whereas reasonability is not. We've made an a priori claim as to why our standards are important in allowing for the structure of debate and the operation of debate to create actual reasonable policy goals and implications. Again, on the T flow, it's going to be a prerequisite voting issue for you. And I think we're just going to keep it there. I've got about 10 seconds and I think I've got through what I need to get through.
Yeah. All right. Set timer. I have lost all of my actual debate timers, so.
Yeah, I'm using my phone too.
It's kind of makes me sad. The answer to that question is yes. Okay. Let's start on topicality. The COF evidence. Can you describe me the credentials of this organization and specifically what expertise they have on USFG water protection policies?
Yes, let me pull up the card real quick. So the COF is
it's an organization called Connect
Yes.
Our Future. Can you
Yes.
describe to me their credentials on this
Right.
topic?
Yes. So their credentials are an analysis. They go through like the analysis of how water protection should work, sort of how the government implicates itself within the protection of water resources and wherein they have the ability to do so.
Okay, so it's not specific to the US is what I'm getting at. Got it. Let's go to this evidence that you just read in the 2NC, the protection doesn't equal management. Can you give me an example of a topical affirmative that would be able to resolve the advantage of the app?
Yes. So a topical version that would be able to solve the advantages of the affirmative would be through water management of pollution, not necessarily through fracking, but managing sort of the pollution that is inherent, that is in the water.
A result of fracking. Okay, so that seems very wide. So if we win that the affirmative meets that standard that you have just provided, are we considered topical?
If you can prove that the affirmative meets that standard of managing water resources through the management of pollution, not fracking, then yes, you'd be topical.
Okay. Is fracking not a pollutant? I'm confused. Does
Fracking as a
fracking
process is not inherently a pollutant. You can make the argument that like the process of fracking.
Okay. No, I got you. I was just looking for the not inherently. I appreciate it. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh, you're good.
Let's go to case because yikes. Look at you with these author indites. All right. Let's see what authors I have left. Specifically, I'm curious about this question of like growth that we started off. It seems as though most of the case debate is going to devolve to the question of whether or not the AF cuts jobs in fracking, which would then lead to higher prices in other fossil fuels. So my question is, what's the justification that inherently these experts in fracking would just like disappear, that they would not get another job within the field?
Right. So the justification then that these experts would just disappear. You don't have an internal link claim as to why those experts would be able to like be freed up for that sort of regulatory purpose. I think you need to have a create that internal link chain as to why those experts.
Is that me?
No, that was
No,
me.
okay.
You're good.
Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is this interconnectedness of like countries leading to war. What's the threshold for when a country will decide to go to war, or rather, what specific factors of connectedness do they look at? I'm gonna run a little bit of prep.
Okay.
When they decide, like, what factors that are like, cool, we can lose trade with this country, like what?
Yeah. So the factors that go into play, the evidence that we read there talks about how the complexity of international relations makes it so that like one small thing like economic downturn for the United States would allow for the continuation of these sorts of proxy wars. And
okay, for the continuation, not the initiation. Got it. Okay. That was like 28 seconds.
Amazing. So our lovely 1N, are you going to send the document out or are you taking a little bit of prep?
Yes, I send it out, but thank you so much for calling me lovely. The order is the counter plan, the patent's counter plan, and the disadvantage. Do you have everything pulled up for the kiddos to see on the live stream? Awesome. First, on the patents counterplan, we're not going for it. Concede that terms are a test of competition. Onto the disadvantage. On 2AC1, the impact outweighs 4 reasons. First, on magnitude, economic decline causes global war and extinction through trade connections. That's Tonneson. Our reasons why war impact should be considered in the debate were in the 2 and C. 2. Second is probability. External dependence makes leaders appeal to anti-foreign sentiments and skepticism of the other, which increases the likelihood of the use of force to retain respect and credibility. Third is time frame. Dangerous shifts happen abruptly, which increases propensity for trade wars and the disruption of transnational production networks, increasing social distress and reducing the credibility of deterrence. Fourth is scope. Global war affects folks internationally, in addition to those affected by environmental toxins. None of the 2AC analysis was contextual to our specific impact of environmental or of economic collapse. Prefer our analysis, and it turns the case for 3 reasons. First, war means nations are less likely to cooperate on multinational green initiatives. Second, the U.S. itself loses focus on environmental policies and diverts attention to war. And third, economic growth is necessary to spur renewable adaptation rather than renewables increasing growth. That's Lee and Lund 21. Economic growth is found to increase renewable energy consumption in the long run. No long-run causality can be detected from renewable energy consumption capital or labor to real GDP. Results in line with previous studies underscore the significance of economic growth in supporting renewable energy consumption, especially in developed economies. Indicates the promotion of renewable energy use will not stimulate economic growth. An increase in renewable energy may not lead to augmentation of productive resources. Next, 2AC2, extend uniqueness. Energy prices are low now due to the purchasing of American gas and driven by an increase in fracking. That's Clemente. They read the Desormain evidence, but it is broad-based and non-contextual. Prefer specific examples which reflect regions of the country served by increasing natural gas production, which facilitates low and stable electricity prices. COVID recovery recovery is stabilizing, proving by flattening declining prices. And the post-COVID economic recovery is happening, but it is fragile. Pickard et al. 3.8. A year after the coronavirus pandemic first drove the U.S. economy into deepest downturn in generations, high-frequency economic indicators illustrate a rebound. Yet there's still ways to go. Data shows a weekly measure of retail sales accelerated for a third week as gauges mobility, consumer confidence, market predict consumer confidence, and electricity prices are low and stable now due to an increase in natural gas production. Page 21. Electricity prices in the U.S. were lower than 2019, less volatile in 2021. In 2020, low prices reflect record low natural gas fuel costs. The monthly averages in most regions of the country during 2020 were flat compared with past years. Prices in the region served by Mid-Continent Independent Services operator were about 14% lower. Prices in the Mid-Atlantic region served by PJM Interconnection were 22% lower. Mark the credit lower. Next is 2AC3. Extend the link. Gains in shale production through fracking reduced domestic cost of natural gas by 62% and electricity by 45%, reduced the global price of oil by 10%. Consumer savings coupled with economic benefits produced the conditions to increase employment in the United States. Stopping fracking devastates the economy and drastically increases costs for energy, petroleum products, and more. That's business. The link term fails. 4 reasons. First, it only describes an end to fracking as a critical first step while not accounting for any of the other steps needed to transition to renewable energy. CrossX proves that the app relies on other agencies to follow in their steps, but they don't have evidence to prove that they will. Their cyclical water analysis doesn't work because you need to purify water for it to be reviewed. It means that a small step like the app still doesn't solve. And second, it is not reverse causal, as it describes how fracking continues pollution, but not how removing fracking stops pollution. Third, their Soto card proves nothing. I would bet my credit card, Squid, but we're on a live stream. 2 reasons. A, it is not descriptive of the affirmative plan to reverse the Halliburton loophole, but instead refers to a ban on new permits and distance regulation. B, Soto doesn't consider the importance of losing U.S. leadership in production of natural gas and oil. And fourth, banning new fracking would also devastate the economy via job loss. Renewable energy wouldn't come close to filling the gaps. It's 420. Such a policy would have devastating economic impacts. 3.9 million jobs would be lost overnight. The form of direct jobs in the extraction industry, indirect jobs, and induced jobs. The natural gas industry directly employs 625,369 Americans, more than 3 times greater than people working in the solar and wind industry. Wind and solar are no excuse for jobs that would be lost. And here's more Ed. Banning fracking would spike energy costs. Loris 2020. The U.S. is the world's largest oil and natural gas producer. Stripping of that distinction would devastate the country's thriving energy sector, the jobs and industries that support it. And economic revitalization in struggling parts of the country with businesses cite cheap, plentiful natural gas as the reason would wipe away hundreds of millions of Americans rely on affordable, reliable power. The USA EIA reported gas prices are the lowest they've been in 20 years. The shale gas boom is acting like a tax cut, putting money in families' wallets. Market credit wallets and household electricity prices drive economic growth. That's Degomas 20 et al. 20. There are signs of a feedback hypothesis in the case of household electricity price and GDP. An indirectional short-run causality seems to emerge from industrial electricity prices to GDP, evidence of the growth hypothesis. I'll speech there. I have 3 seconds.
Alrighty. Squid, you said you took 28 seconds of prep. I think I'll be running the rest, which would be.
Is that like 7:32?
All right, let me set that up real quick. 7:32. I'm using my phone, so it's really like messed up.
That's the worst.
2.
So while they prep, we're going to talk more about this debate. The live stream got a little funky. My share screen got behind, so I just had to pause it. But we're all caught up now, which is great. Alex and Ben, since you all are here still live, what are some thoughts on that 1NR and the 2NC? How did you like the block split? What do you think are some things that the debaters did really well? What are things that you think you would do better if you were to re-give them? Let's start with Alex.
Like I said last time, I think like they're just really good at being concise. Cause I know I struggle with that a lot. Like I always kind of tend to ramble on and repeat the same things, and I think everything they say like has a purpose to be said instead of just saying the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, that's awesome. Ben, do you have any thoughts on the block?
Sophia was like about like certain like bringing up stuff that was said in CrossX and earlier to incorporate incorporate that into their speeches.
Yeah, you're right. So something that both I think Jackson and Sophia did really, really well in this block was cite moments and cross-ex, reread affirmative evidence. You'll notice how any times Del Pro made an argument, or answered an argument, they first extended the 1NC evidence, then they indicted the 2AC evidence, and then they read more cards. That's a really good formula for all of you who are learning to extend a disad or really do any sort of case debate. You're also going to notice that Jackson did something really similar and followed a really kind of familiar pattern that's like what Del Pro did on the disad, meaning anytime there was an argument made on the case, they answered each point, but they also did so in a way that was you could flow straight down. The only edit I would really make about this case debating from the 2NC is that sometimes it got hard to flow, you might notice, because it was all these points at once. Something that's easier is if you break it up with subpoints. So maybe it's first, the plan doesn't solve growth. Extend our argument first. Here's what our card said, and here's why you prefer it. Now, they said the following answers. I'll line by line those for you. 1, this wasn't answered on the disad. Here's why. That really you don't need to address as much, but it's an example. 3rd, they said this card's about disclosure. Here's why that's wrong. So now you're getting in numbering and labels, which are easier. Even if numbers aren't your thing, totally fine. You can still have a little bit clearer sense of labels. Labels are your best friend because it means that the judge has something really quick and easy to type down. So instead of sort of having it be, here's 500 things in a mini paragraph that I'm going to read at you, break it up, make it one sentence and then all these subpoints. You can have subpoints for your subpoints even. That just makes it easier for everyone to follow along. It also is great to prioritize those labels when you're giving a speech. So it means instead of saying, we solve job loss, which means that we do this, and that proves the AF solves this card. That's a lot of things to get to finally type in AF solves job loss or AF solves this card. You want to say, 1, the AF solves job loss. Here's why. Instead of giving all of the warrants and then the claim. So you want claim, warrants, and give your claim something catchy, something fun. So on the disad, it's not as exciting because it's just a link or its uniqueness, but that's a way to do it. On the case, Jackson was really awesome at this, how they said, extend that there's no impact from fracking fluids. That's a way to do it. A really great example is you can also give things fun names that are references. So maybe instead of the turn, it's something like a Lorax turn, like Alex, we were talking about this morning, how it leads to further things elsewhere. It might look like one's policy, but instead you lead to getting rid of the entire rainforest because everyone's wearing a Sneed. Do you see now how like we're using fun references to explain a concept that might be kind of complex for a judge, especially if you're doing local circuit debate, and we're making it more approachable. It's something that's automatically recognizable, doesn't need a lot of explanation or warranting out because you're on it, you get it. And it's also easy to flow. So if I have Lorax turn with the application to the AF, it's all I really need on my flow because I kind of got it. And that's something that is really helpful when thinking about how your speech is translated to a judge's flow, which is something that not everyone always thinks about. So it's about how am I communicating that not only gets what I want to say on their flow in the way I said it, but also how can they keep up with me? Am I clear? Am I concise? What is the best way of communicating? And that's when debate becomes more of a word game. It looks like Jonathan's ready to give this awesome 1AR. So let's get this order and document and we're ready to go.
Yeah, I still need to edit the document real quick.
Oh, no worries.
But
I'm happy
yeah.
to keep talking.
Yeah, for sure. Just give me a
yeah.
couple more seconds.
No worries. Let us know when you're ready. So, Alex, what are your thoughts on this block split? Did you want to see the counter plan extended? Did you like that it was T in case and then the DA? Give me some thoughts.
I liked how it was because I think it gives the more important things more time to do instead of, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. And you're spot on. By picking and choosing the arguments to extend, the negative block did a really great job going in depth on the issues that they want to talk about. And it was smart because they realized, we have a couple different paths to success. We have a T argument that comes first. Jackson pointed out that it's a prerequisite. Nothing else matters except that flow. So I look there first. Then I have a disav with an impact that Delprat did an amazing job with some impact help that explains why that also matters more than the affirmative. Then we got some offense on case explaining why there's a turn. Maybe there's a combination there of the turn and some case defense that could be a 2 and R. So in this 1AR, Jonathan has to cover a bunch of different 2 and Rs that they could give. So the kind of point of that spiel was to point out that, yeah, Alex was right. They picked and chose and narrowed down the block, but they also gave themselves multiple 2 and R options by going in depth on a couple areas of the debate that are really fruitful for them. It means where they're ahead with their best evidence, where they know the warrants better, where they know that there are some tricks that they can pull, where they know the affirmative didn't cover quite as well. Maybe they made that decision because they saw those 2 AC cards in the counter plan and were like, oh my God, these were better than we thought. We're ditching the counter plan. Those are different ways that you can go about block decisions. So it's not just based on where the affirmative did best, but also based upon where they were the best and where they feel most comfortable. Something that's also interesting to note is how Delprat went about the top of the DA. So did you see how Delprat not only extended all their impacts and gave reasons why each outweighed that were super easy to flow and write down? They answered the impact work, and then they had reasons why the disad turns the F. The only thing to add to this is a sentence that is, if we win that the disad turns the F, it means we meet all their framing standards and the framing contention and offense goes away because it means we meet. It means it doesn't apply. We understand that slow death happens and is important to talk about. That's why we've explained our impacts the way we do. That's why economic decline isn't just a scary war scenario, but rather a reason why we can't deal with fracking or environmental regulations because we have all these other crazy things going on. So that's a way to kind of make dealing with framing contentions easier, is by explaining why your arguments meet their framing and kind of make it so it goes to the negative as well. And it's less of an offensive reason for the affirmative to be a good idea. Does that kind of make sense, Ben? I'll take that as a yes. Ben, what is something you really liked about this block? Before Jonathan gives his speech. Ben, you there? Ben, unmute. Oh, your Wi-Fi's cutting out? No worries. Feel free to chat it to us. What is something that you really liked? Never mind. We'll deal with the hard Wi-Fi. So we'll get that after the 1AR. You can be our 1AR expert. So let's have Jonathan's order and get this started.
All right, for sure. So I don't have a doc I'm going off right now. It's just a bunch of like written down stuff, but I'll write it and type it in a doc so I can send later after my speech. But with that being said, my order will be T, case, and the disad. So case will be an overview, and then the advantage and solvency. I could repeat that one more time because I did mumble a little bit. So again, it's going to be T, case, in the case, it'd be an overview, the advantage, and then the solvency. And after the case, it'd be the econ disad. That being said, everybody good? All right. So on T, extend the we meet argument. The affirmative is a core conversation of this topic. Our Johnson 21 evidence expresses the connections of fracking and water management. The quote from the evidence is that the SWA was enacted in 1974 to prevent the degradation of drinking water with underground injection control UIC program serving as a primary enforcement mechanism of the act. The AF is a form of the primary enforcement mechanism used to regulate water pollution, which means that the mechanism of the mechanism of the affirmative is key form of protecting water regulation, which means that we do meet their interpretation. You could prefer the way we view the debate because there's forms of predictable limits, because fracking is not necessarily something that is distant from water regulation. As said above, water regulation is still a form of removing fracking, which is a threat of form of pollution. During crossings, there was said that fracking can lead to pollution, means that stopping fracking is a form of directly moving a mechanism that disrupts water pollution or creates forms of water wastewater, which specifically affects water resources. And then don't buy any form of like potential abuse being said, because all the exploding limits, there's no example on how specifically talking about fracking explodes so much limits that creates the undebatable debates, because there's still ways of having these conversations of water resources via like discussing fracking. And then during 2&C, they said that fairness is a more better metric than reasonability, but metrics within reasonability are determined by the case and interpretation debates, meaning that the more debates we have, the more form of a standard we have in a community in these certain debates, while fairness is a metric established by one single person, meaning that one set of evidence or one person that says this is what we're debating on is said, and that is necessarily bad for the community because we aren't able to create new forms of understanding and create better, more meaningful debates in which we are, as a community, agree that something is reasonable and something is able to be allowed in a certain topic, such as fracking, which as said in the 1AC and 2AC is specifically very important issue that's going on and should be tackled. Onto case, you could send forms of overview during the status quo. There's different thresholds of mining and forms of companies and other industries using fracking as a measure to disrupt forms of water resources. Absent the fracking continues and creates a form of explosion past manageable levels, meaning that there'll be more fracking in certain places and more water pollution and air pollution. This is all coming from our Hein, Kim, and Smith evidence and the BLAC evidence that specifically explains the harms of fracking. Now is only now we need to fix this form of issue now, because without it there'll be a full collapse of water protection. The AF shows how the Halliburton loophole is a force that tries to regulate forms of fracking, but doesn't, due to other companies using this loophole in order to create more forms of detrimental harm to the environment and to the people who live in these areas. And then onto the line by line, there's forms of all the issues they said of like no forms of solvency or how solvency is disproven because of the way that our evidence specifically explains how forms of stopping fracking leads to forms of stopping forms of specific issues, such as like water pollution in certain chemicals. Even if it's not a full-on 100% solve, the AF still provides specifically major changes in the way fracking works, means that it solves the majority of our impacts, and it specifically explains how our impacts are able to be resolved due to the affirmative. And onto the solvency. Onto the solvency, the affirmative plan stops loopholes and creates more regulation on this fracking, meaning that all the evidence said that the AF's loophole does not resolve any issues is wrong, because it doesn't provide any forms of advantage, does not provide any forms of information explaining how that works. Now onto the disad. So first, I want to extend the link turn here. Explains how the affirmative is a key step to forming forms of renewable energy transitions and allows forms of new growth within energy transitions. And you could also extend all our impact defense, explaining how forms of big impacts are really wrong, because some of them are very hard to determine how it works. A bunch of the link work done in the 2NC was good, but it's not specifically explained how the connectivity is there and how it could be a risk, but it could be a small risk, which means that our impacts have more probability of happening, which means the impact should be preferred.
Sweet. So I assume Jackson's gonna take the rest of their prep for this 2NR. In the meantime, Alex and Ben, let's talk about this 1AR, and everyone who's watching this on YouTube, either live or in the future. So Ben, let's have you kick us off. What is something you really liked about this 1AR?
What I liked is how Jonathan pointed out the lack of evidence and the problems with their cards. I think that's really important. So pretty much like your cards are better, so that way the judge will prefer your cards and hopefully
Yeah.
your argument.
Yeah, that's a great thing to notice. So having reasons why your evidence should be preferred, that can be in terms of recency. So you remember Squid was like, this card's from 2015. How does it apply? It's 2021. That's a great moment because it tells you why recency matters. The next step is not just it's 2021, it's what has happened since 2015 that matters, which is something that they did really well. And then another kind of evidence in terms of why you should prefer it, or another reason why, is about qualifications. So you might remember how in the demo debate, when the other one, Victoria, said, hey, our evidence is from an econ professor. Here's why that's better than a bunch of computer models. That's a reason why someone's card could be better. And then the last is about context, or maybe, so if it's issue specific, which is something you saw again in this, about evidence being contextual. And sometimes people also get into questions of whether or not someone's qualifications are suspect, meaning not just a reason why your qualifications are good, but a reason why someone else's card is a little fishy. So remember how that AFP card read on case about why the AF can't solve emissions or why they can't solve fracking fluids. That AFP is an Institute of Petroleum, which Victoria told you in that other demo debate. And that's a reason why you should be suspect of that card. So that's another way to kind of talk about evidence and why you prefer it to different other pieces of evidence read in the debate. That was a great point, Ben. Alex, what's something you liked about this 1AR?
I like the fact that Jonathan used their time not only to answer to other people's like stuff, but whenever they were answering to other people's arguments, they made sure to explain their own. So that way it was like killing two birds with one stone. Instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to respond to their arguments and talk about mine. I liked how they used their own somebody else's arguments to further explain their own.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the hard part about the 1AR is you're super time pressed and you've got to make decisions. That means embedded clash kind of becomes a thing. Embedded clash means you're adding statements like, which means that, or judge, you should do this, or this outweighs, or this comes first, to kind of give more oomph to different arguments that help it apply to other parts of the debate. So, Alex, can you give me an example of some embedded clash? Maybe look at that case debate.
I'm not sure.
I have an example to help you out a little bit. So when Jonathan got to the case debate, they didn't address this growth argument because they extended the link turn on the disad instead. But they did explain how stopping fracking solves pollution and chemicals, even if it's not 100% the acid key first step, and does solve a lot of their impacts. But I didn't write this down on my flow because I was wondering if one of you would catch it. Jonathan said not only water pollution, but air pollution, which is an embedded clash argument addressing this turn down here about emissions. So Jonathan made a sneaky argument to say, group those last two arguments, the turn and the solvency claim, we solve, moving on. Not even going to focus much on this. We're a key step in the right direction. That link turn they're making on the disad is really similar. They're kind of pulling from a lot of different sources to make this one argument. And because they're kind of consolidating that way, you get a sense that this 2AR is probably going to go a lot on this link turn and really focus on reasons why the app's a good first step. Something that is of note, though, if Jonathan had gone to the disad and only extended the non-unique argument and the link turn, Ben, what would that mean for this disad? If there was only a non-unique and the link turn extended without impact defense.
It would make it a lot difficult. It would just make it a lot more difficult to win because you are not attacking their impacts.
No, think about it this way. So if the disad story goes, US energy prices are low now, but they're stable. And the link says increasing banning fracking leads to a spike in prices, and that hurts the economy. And the impact is economic decline is really scary and bad. And then if Jonathan had only said energy prices are high now, and the plan decreases prices and leads to a shift in renewables, which helps the economy. What does that make? What does that mean? Can you use some debate language? What is the buzzword to describe what this disad is now? Oh, you cut out? No worries. I'll just spoil the hint. So that would have straight turned the disad. The way to straight turn a disad is either by choosing to only impact turn it or to do a non-unique and link turn. That's an option for a debate, meaning if you straight turn a disad, it basically becomes a new advantage for you because your non-unique argument is like an inherency claim about the world and the current state of energy prices. And then your link turn is a reason why the app solves that impact, a reason why the app is a key first step in this direction. However, this 1AR chose not to straight turn the disad. That means Jonathan chose to only extend the link turn and impact defense and skip the uniqueness debate, which means it's just a question of link versus link turn and whether or not the impact has any weight against the AF. If Jonathan did not touch the impact debate alone and only extended a link turn, that would be a pretty tough spot to be in because it means now the only thing the negative has to do to win is win a risk of a link, which isn't the hardest thing to do in the world, especially given how many links Del Pra read in the 1NR. Del Pra made a really smart decision in the 1NR to read a bunch of links and have a diversified link block because it means now Jackson, if they choose to go for the disad, which I kind of think they should, I'll explain why later, is really helpful because now Jackson can choose to pick a link that the link turn does not address and has a specific internal link to economic decline that, again, the link turn can't really get game on. And now they have a really easy way to win this debate because then it's just a question of whether or not they have a link to their big impact, which they're already winning outweighs and turns the app. So what are some things, as Jackson keeps prepping, that you think, Alex and Ben, that Jonathan could have done better? So we'll start with Alex. Do you want to unmute and tell us? What's some advice you would give Jonathan for this 1AR for a redo? Maybe Ben, if Alex is having some internet issues, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, one thing I thought Jonathan could have done a little better was impact calc at the end there. I think Jonathan might have ran out of time or something, but I think impact calc is really important and didn't get to it enough.
Yeah, so before Jackson gives the speech, I'll kind of talk a little bit about that because I think you're definitely right. So in the 1AR, you're super time pressed. The way to get impact calc in is put it in your overview. So you have a shortened version. Instead of the 2 to 3 sentence overview that you have for your 2AC, it's now 1 to 2 sentences. And instead of a full sentence and a full clause, because I'm kind of a grammar nerd, I'll use that language, you have a phrase at the end, which says, that means the F outweighs because we win probability, it's happening now, and it'll escalate and cause their impact. So a reason why the case turns the disad. I like putting that on the case debate because it means now that kind of messes up Jackson's flow. Jackson now has to address the case turns the disad on the case debate, and it's kind of consolidating where you want to do your impact calc in the 2AR, which is on the case. I agree. I think that instead of just extending impact defense, the way to make this 1AR a little bit on the next level is to address reasons why the disad doesn't or just to have reasons why the disad does not outweigh and why the disad does not turn the case. That's really helpful because now you're getting in more defense claims to kind of make your argument seem more compelling. And it means even if Squid chooses to not really fully address the link turn or other arguments they're making on the disad, they still have reasons from the 1AR they can cite and pull from that don't sound too new as to why, even if you have 100% risk of the disad, the case still comes first. And it doesn't really matter anything else because you have this case that outweighs and turns the disad where the disad can't outweigh and turn the case. And having those start in the 1AR is really helpful because, again, you don't want to sound too new because we've all had that judge say, this 2AR was too new, I didn't buy those arguments. And that's the most soul-crushing thing to hear when you, especially when you give an awesome speech. All right, so let's have Jackson give us an order and we'll be ready to go.
Okay, we are going to do T, and then we're going to the disad, and then we'll go to case. It'll be the advantage and then solvency. And if we're all good, Oh, 1 second. My phone decided not to work. Okay. First, on T, concede the Johnson evidence. The affirmative lies within the core of the topic. You can't think about fracking practices without thinking about water protection, and we're not going for it. Next, onto the DA. The impact. The impact outweighs on magnitude. The Johnson evidence explains why you should prioritize discussions of existential risk. First, they're critically important to understand the complexity of interdependence and its implications on international relations, which is the best way to explain why a period of economic downturn would likely catalyze the conditions necessary for interstate and proxy war. Second, the affirmative's monthly evidence in response to this question is limited by its oversimplification of the interconnected international relations and how they implicate themselves in interstate and proxy wars. Third, extend the Besdick piece of evidence. This evidence is specifically contextual to why economic downturn, because of banning fracking, would be more than enough to facilitate these conditions that lead to war. We're also going to outweigh on probability. External dependence makes leaders appeal to anti-foreign sentiments and skepticism of the other, which increases the likelihood of the use of force to retain respecting credibility. And then on time frame, dangerous shifts happen abruptly, which increases the propensity for trade wars and the disruption of transnational production networks, increasing our social distress and reducing the credibility of deterrence. The negative is ahead on the question of how interconnected international relations operate, especially in the context of fracking, and that turns the case. Which means that war means that nations are less likely to cooperate on green initiatives, and the U.S. itself loses focus on environmental policies and has less prowess to resolve the conditions of environmental degradation. Extend to the Lee and Long 2021 evidence, economic growth is necessary to spur renewable adaptation rather than the other way around. It doesn't flip the other way, and this is why we have to have a strong economic growth and backbone in order to allow for the development of renewable energies and other technologies that can resolve the effects of climate change and avoid the impact of interstate and proxy war. And we have a uniqueness claim. The Hodge evidence: electricity prices are low and stable now in areas served by increased natural gas production. Mid-continent independent service operator had a 40% lower cost, where a PM interconnection had a 22% lower cost. That means that when we have fracking, these electricity prices are lower, and we have less of a chance for the potential for economic downturn that would lead to the impacts of war, which are going to outweigh. And the link, the Besdick evidence is the link. Extend that gains in shale production through fracking reduce domestic costs of natural gas by 63% and electricity by 45%, reduce the global price of oil by 10%. Consumer savings coupled with economic benefits produce the conditions to increase employment within the United States. And the plan would devastate the economy and devastate these potential employment gains and drastically increase the cost for energy, petroleum products, and more, which would just put us at a greater risk for the continuation of interstate conflict. And the link turn failed. It doesn't account for other steps to transition to renewable energy. It's not reverse causal. It describes how fracking continues pollution, but not how removing the operation would solve it. Their evidence is also not descriptive of the affirmative. It doesn't offer an example. It doesn't offer examples of how getting rid of fracking would allow for the conditions to be met. There's also no answer to the devastation of the economy via job loss. Renewable energy is not a large enough industry to even fulfill 1/3 of the jobs lost. We'd have 3.9 million jobs that would be lost overnight, which would immediately catalyze economic downturn and trigger the impact of the disad. Banning fracking spikes energy costs too, making certain that the United States advantage in the area gets lost. This means that the U.S. consumers lose $203 billion annually, which allows for, again, the triggering of the impact of the disad, which outweighs. Case. First, on case, the plan doesn't solve growth. There it is. They dropped in the plan that it doesn't solve growth, extend that fracking industry is a superpower and they will only continue to gain traction. Fracking is a significant geopolitical force that is responsible for the growth of the U.S. energy sector. And marketplace innovation is incentivized by trade secrets that maintain dominance over international competitors. That continued growth makes their impact inevitable, meaning there's only a risk of the disadvantage, and that's all you're going to be voting on in the debate. Also, on solvency, the plan to close the Halliburton loophole is unable to mitigate the expansion of fracking and the harms of environmental degradation, making their impacts inevitable. There is no enforcement mechanism for the regulation post-plan, meaning you should be suspect and skeptical of the plan's ability to challenge the current industry's avoidance tactics, which was in their Martinez evidence. Rather, the plan would just remove one possible avenue by which this currently occurs and fail to provide established regulations by which the fracking industry can be held to. The affirmative also offers no clear articulation of how the plan functions to force the application of regulations in light of the history of avoidance, and the app doesn't solve. Closing the Halliburton loophole means that fracking is exempt from underground injection control regulation, but because those regulations have holes in enforcement, it means that the plan isn't enough. With the plan isolated in its own, it's not going to be able to resolve the impacts of environmental degradation and only triggers the impacts of the disad, which outweigh.
Right, so while Squid takes the rest of their prep time for this 2AR, let's get some thoughts from some of the other debaters who are watching now with us. So Ben, because I think your Wi-Fi is working still, what is something you liked about this 2R? And do you think that Jackson made the right choice to go for the disad instead of T?
Yeah, I think Jackson made the right choice to go for the disad instead of T because, I mean, T, in my opinion, against the SAF was more of just a like a or whatever the correct terminology is. I liked how Jackson explained all the evidence of what would happen if this were to occur to show, why what happened at the time. And so,
Yeah, that's awesome. I think you're right. So I think the disad was definitely the right choice, given how great the 1NR was and how in-depth Delpra was in terms of the impact calc debate and beating back on all the affirmative evidence. So I think T could have been a viable decision though, because something that has been lacking from the affirmative in this debate is a counterinterp. That's really scary. It's hard to put all your eggs in one basket with just a we meet argument, because it means that any reason you have to prefer your standards don't make a bunch of sense, because your standards are about the model of debate that you are endorsing under in a world in which your app is topical. So that's a little bit scary for the affirmative to not have a counterinterp the entire debate. And that should have been something pointed out by the 2NC, because again, if it's about competing interps, only the negative has an interp. There's no interp at all really extended by the affirmative, which again, makes it kind of an easy debate to win. So I think Jackson had different choices. I think the disad was a little bit easier and cleaner to win coming out of the 1AR. So I think you're right. Let's talk about kicking out a T though. So Jackson kicked out a T in this debate. Kicking out of T is important in some debates. For example, if you're debating a critical affirmative and you're reading framework, that's a really important debate to actually kick out of framework proper and answer any offense that could be cross-applied. However, in most traditional T debates against policy affirmatives, where you also have more policy off-case arguments, there's not much offense that they could really cross-apply. And it's not really needed to fully kick out of T. Instead, you just don't have to go to that page. You can just kind of let it sail into the wind or fly into the sunset because it's not really relevant anymore. So another way to do this 2R is to just start with a disad. Kind of makes it a little more ethosy as well, because you can start with saying, we won this debate, vote negative. We have a whole disad story, and here's how we outweigh and turn the affirmative. And here's why their impact defense doesn't apply before I clean up the rest of this debate. Because that now makes it starting your 2R and final rebuttal with more of a punch. You now have awesome reasons why you're winning this debate. And then you have reasons why they're losing, which is a better way to start a speech, especially your final rebuttal, than kicking something. Because if you start ethos-wise, you don't really give a great image when you're conceding a page and getting rid of it, because you're kind of admitting that you lost it, even though you're making a smart decision strategically. So it's better to start with what you're winning and then kick it if you need to. And again, kicking T in this debate wasn't really as necessary. You can just choose to not go to it. So in this debate, Jackson chose, or did make some decisions on this flow. So Jackson did a great job explaining why the disad outweighs in terms of existential risk, and then also having reasons why it turns the case and why the specific impacts matter most. A change that I would have made is start this disad flow by giving the story of the disad. Tell us what the disad says. Give us a feeling that we are not only reading the same book as you, but we're on the same page about how the arguments all interact. And that's a really helpful way to sort of frame the debate for the judge. So when they're giving you an RFD, they can tell you the story that they want to vote for. So that's something I thought was a little missing, but isn't the end of the world. All right, Ben has to head out, so I guess it's just me talking to all of you all. Oh, Squid, are you ready?
I think so. Honestly, I wasn't counting prep time, so.
No worries. Good for an order whenever you are, because I think it's just me following now.
Okay. Typically, I just go straight down, but for this debate, we're going to start on the case with a significant overview. And then I'm going to the dissad, where I will start on the impact debate. Anyone not ready? Speak now. Beautiful. Oh, I'm not ready. I don't have a phone. My phone go. Sorry. 5 minutes. Okay. You are voting affirmative on the case outweighs, and there's a non-zero risk of the case solving the dissent. The affirmative amends the Safe Water Drinking Act to reverse the 2005 Energy Act that led to a massive explosion in federal fracking. Absent the act, fracking will continue to bypass the disclosure regulations and further pollute groundwater through wastewater leaks. The T is a wash, but it gives us some solvency. The AF is a swift nationwide change in the policies which allow fracking and violate the water protection laws. That swift action ensures that private operators are required to meet the disclosure regulations, which makes identifying the toxins in groundwater both easy and more efficient to address. The question of disclosure regulations is the threshold for AF solvency. If we win, or we have won, that the AF forces that increase in disclosure and makes it more efficient across the board, then there's no question of whether or not the AF provides a significant, substantial, and good change to status quo. Quick analysis on the counter plan. They've conceded parts of case solvency there. The Johnson evidence is fire, and it says that the federal litigation over the Safe Water Drinking Act is key to maintain the enforcement and create a stable information collection sector. More on the case proper. Oh, I didn't mean for you to flip. My bad. On the case proper, they have little game on the solvency debate. It's mostly flexing. In the squo, expert operators who already have the training and capacity to ensure regulation enforcement are being distracted by the post-facto attempts at preventing the damage from wastewaters that have already been leaked. Only by getting them out ahead of the problem and shifting their operations away from reactive responses to fracking and more to proactive enforcement of anti-leaking measures are we able to ensure that the violence caused by fracking is directly mitigated. The MURSIC evidence has been slept on this whole debate. It's disrespectful. It specifically says that these experts want to help with the regulations. They want to, but they're constantly having to be reactive by their corporations because the corporations are able to bypass the disclosure regulations. Their frustrations have been made evident in the years worth of anti-fracking lobbying. This gives the AF, or the AF gives them leeway for the experts to use their tools of the federal and the tools of the federal government to ensure that the regulations are enforced properly by trained experts who know what the heck they're doing. Now is key. We have meta uniqueness on the question of being able to protect water resources because squirrel regulations are being rolled back based on the price inflation fears. The AF intervenes into the situation to regulate the industry, which stabilizes the prices and ensure or mitigates the disparate impacts due to fracking. Water protection policies keep getting stalled in the federal chambers because the question of enforcement is continually brought up, but is always disregarded of because of fears of prices. Only by making fracking a model scenario for the federal government to regulate will the USFG be able to ensure further widespread water protections from things like pipelines leaking and illegal drilling. That's the Clinton, McGovern, and Martinez evidence. I'm gonna do the growth debate here. Also note my headphones are dying, so if you can't hear me like wave drops or something, I'm sorry. On the growth debate, jobs will not be lost. That's hyperbolic. MURSIC is fantastic on this question. It's been there since the 1AC. Not only will the experts be relocated, but any operators who are currently trained in fracking can easily be trained by the USFG to act as enforcement operators. That means that their claim of job loss within the industry is bankrupt. It's pure fear mongering. Even if You don't buy that. The shifts in the energy employment have been happening since the 2000s. All major suppliers of energy have undergone monumental shifts in the last 20 years, and we have not seen a severe disruption in the job market uniquely caused by them. When one company closes, another gets more employees. There's no reason to assume that the app is the singular cause of growth loss. Even the $230 billion statistic that they cite, that they claim will be lost, that is non-unique. Markets have experienced significant losses in the billions in profits since at least the 2009 recession, which disproves the threshold on their econ impact. If anything, the app ensures growth only by regulating the industry to ensure that the harm caused by fracking doesn't wreck the entire market. Are we able to stabilize the economy? I'll do the impact debate on the DISAD. Go there. The environment outweighs collapse, or the environment collapse outweighs. When groundwater gets polluted, companies have to work harder to use it as a resource, and the general public has to pay more money to get clean water in their pipes. The magnitude is where we win the debate, because they've refused to acknowledge the disparate impacts caused by fracking, which means their impact calc is morally bankrupt, but it also only cares about non-natives, which is a reason why I prefer app.
Yay, debate. That was amazing. Thank you all so much. That was so incredible. I don't know if we're going to talk more about this debate. I don't think we really have to, since all the kiddos are gone, but even for people watching at home, this was an amazing debate and a really awesome instruction by Squid to explain how to go for case outweighs a DISAD. But we'll turn it over to Jasmine to kind of close everything out.
Sorry, yes, I have to do this quickly because I'm kind of judging a debate. So yes, y'all, thank you so much for watching this debate, for when you do watch this debate, and to everyone who participated in it. This was excellent. Thank you so much to all of you. A special shout out to Anna for doing all of this instruction, an asset. And I hope that y'all take advantage of this opportunity to grow your understanding of debate from all the different kind of mechanisms of it. So yeah, y'all, IG poll is going up on Instagram. So if you watch this debate, or if you're going to watch it in the next 24 hours, it is up to be voted upon. So yes, y'all, thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Jasmine.
Perfect. And then can you make me the host that I can stop the stream?